I have a question of Sister Simone that is very important because of what is happening. Most people in this room know that local governments can't do much unless the state government allows them to do these things. And one of those things is what Sister talked about, which is the wage in Virginia. About 5 years ago, I asked my very good friend, Janet Howell, who has the most seniority in the Senate, if she could get a piece of legislation introduced and passed in the Senate and the legislature that would allow local governments like Fairfax County to have a higher wage than the state wage. And she said, this was about 5 years ago, she said, impossible, politically impossible. My question is, since Tuesday, is it now politically possible to get the government of Virginia to allow local governments to have a higher wage than $7?
Okay, some of it's in Kent's part, but let me share one story that I do know is, and this is tea leaves, and when you look at the tea leaves, I think what we have to do is try to figure out where do we start the push, and then we keep pushing, because it's going to take time, because it's not enough to get this through. So, but what I do know is when we were in Asheville, North Carolina, Asheville had raised the wage, their minimum wage, and they're sort of like the crescent of Virginia. You know, they're a little blue spot in an otherwise red state, and the state legislature took away their authority right away, so they couldn't do it. That's what Virginia did, right? But let me tell you what Asheville did. They didn't just stop. What Asheville did was organize, the nonprofits got together and organized a certification of employers in Asheville who paid a living wage. And then they got the newspaper to monthly publish the list of businesses who paid a living wage. And when we were there, it's a couple of years ago now, I know it's still continuing, but when we were there, they had already certified 400 businesses in Asheville who paid a living wage. So my hunch is some of us who do advocacy, when we get turned back like that and we get so frustrated, what we are called to is a new form of creativity. If we're committed to the issue, how do we do it? And I was really struck by your comments about the working in the prisons, that when you get blocked one place, you keep going around, you keep pushing. And that's what we need. We need to keep pushing. We need to push legislation. Well, let's figure out what else can we do to make sure that our people can live in dignity. That's the challenge. Now, Delegate Plum, do you want to talk about politics?
Well, I think as Joe knows, I've introduced the raising the minimum wage in Virginia for several years now. One of the problems I have with this is that each time I introduce the bill and it goes to committee, the first group speaking against the bill is the Fairfax County Chamber of Commerce. That's not good. Now, I think I have successfully shamed the Reston Chamber of Commerce into not testifying against my bill, but others still yet continue to do that. At the same time, I will tell you, I've been working in parallel with trying to get Virginia earned income tax credit refundable, as it is in many states. However, now with the uncertainty about the earned income tax credit federally, I'm not sure where that's going to stand. But that's the other alternative route to raising the minimum wage, would be to make the earned income tax credit refundable. So we're going to continue to work on it.
The earned income tax credit ain't going any place at the federal level, so but we got to keep pushing to make sure that happens. Yeah. But I want to make it abundantly clear, the earned income tax credit is a business subsidy. Yeah. Let's be real about it, because the whole idea of markets is that in our capitalist system is that the price covers the cost of production plus a little bit of profit. And if people are using the earned income tax credit to survive, this is not a poverty program, it's a business program, because then they don't have to pay their employees a living wage. So let's go talk to the Chamber of Commerce about what they're using what's basically an anti-poverty program as a business subsidy. And I don't know where I come from, that just seems to be bad economics. Just saying. Not that I have any feelings in this.
Just to sing Delegate Plum's praises, SALT had a minimum wage bill to raise it from $5.15 to $8.50, and it went through the Senate after 3 years, came to the House, and the House Committee, Commerce and Labor, killed it, and Ken was on the committee, and he says, I'm gonna pull some kind of strings here, and he couldn't tell us what he was gonna do, but he got it reconsidered and got it to the floor. So he's that kind of guy when he takes on an issue, he takes ownership and he works for it. Kevin.
Yes, I have a question for Gay.
Oh, I'm sorry, you'll be next.
Gay, I thought that the Commissioner of Corrections was when appointed 2 or 3 years ago. He had some progressive ideas, and also, is there any way we could get any citizens on a review or advisory board? What's holding up all this improvements in corrections? We see studies come out and reports, and nothing ever comes of it.
Well, I'd say everything takes time. The Harold Clark, who's the current director of corrections, his kind of what he was known for when he came to Virginia was his interest in reentry programs. So he has done some things, I understand, in terms of, for example, Virginia's procedure now is to put people in a reentry pod when they're within 2 years of completing their sentence, and where they're given resources about how to find jobs and you know, that sort of thing. I've heard some mixed reports about how well that works, but certainly it was a step in the right direction. We find when we hear from prisoners and their families, we not only hear a lot of anguish about solitary confinement, but we hear a lot of complaints about abusive treatment that's related to it, with retaliatory behavior like withholding food from people as punishment, with not allowing them to go to recreation or to have a shower. That sort of thing goes on a lot. And you know, as I say, we can't verify all these reports. We don't necessarily assume that every single word that every prisoner tells us is the absolute truth. But all these allegations certainly merit serious investigation, and we've had a lot of difficulty getting the Department of Corrections to take these complaints seriously. The default assumption is that these guys are liars and they're making this stuff up. And we always are told we do not allow mistreatment in the prisons. And I think that's an aspiration that's probably sincere on the part of many, if not most, of the corrections officials, but they're asking us to believe that every single complaint we receive is a fabrication, and that's just not plausible. I don't know if that answers your question. But
I think to help answer the question, we came to work with Gay because we worked on, women in prison sometimes are pregnant and they're shackled when they went into labor. And when we went to see the Director of Corrections, he immediately said, I don't know what went on here before. He was new. He said it isn't going to happen. And he worked with us to prepare regulations to stop it. It has been stopped, and I can tell you his staff were not happy with him. His top nurse was there when he committed to work with us on regulations, and she would not look at him. She would not talk to him. She just shook her head no. So that's what he had to overcome in coming in, and I think, you know, he has been making a good effort, but we got a long way to go still on solitary confinement.
And I think on a hopeful note, I mean, as I said, this takes really, it takes a lot of time to make progress, but there are definite signs that the Department of Corrections is feeling pressure to change, to keep working on getting more and more people out of isolation. And, you know, there's litigation pending. They're feeling pressure from a lot of different directions, and I'm hopeful, but it doesn't happen fast enough.
Okay, we got a question over here.
Thank you. My name is Astrid Ruiz. This is my first exposure to SALT. Clara Billigan invited me, and I'm very happy to have come here on this cold Saturday morning. I specialize in rural development through access to opportunities for self-employment and entrepreneurship. But I grew up in Indiana, but I've been out of this country for 30 years in Europe and the last 10 years in West Africa working with rural communities. And I recently came back, and I'm still in shock. I'm in shock with what's happening in rural America. So I decided to put my knowledge, my experience, my expertise to work. I've created a company. It's called UpBoost. It's a startup, and that's my way of giving back. Okay, and I'd just like to know how I can work with you and how you can work with me. Thank you.
Can I just respond just quickly? Astrid, that is so important, because the piece that I didn't have a chance to talk about was the difference of poverty in different parts of our country. The urban reality, Robin, who I talked about, who has to live in a homeless shelter because she can't afford rent in the minimum wage, is a big urban wealthy reality. There's the small city reality, which Richmond, Scranton, a bunch of other mid-sized, and then there's absolute rural poverty, which is an entirely different kettle of fish, where folks are, and your slides showed the decline in population in those areas, and that I met a woman in rural Kentucky who said to me she didn't want her kids going to college because that would mean they would never come home. And we have got to figure out, how do we deal with the reality of rural population in our nation? Because, for instance, with healthcare business model depends on an urban environment because it depends on volume. All this high-cost service depends on facilities that can be paid for with volume of clients. That doesn't work in the rural reality, and some of the big problem with the Affordable Care Act is not the Affordable Care Act, it's the business model of healthcare. And so what we've got to do, and praise God you're bringing your talents home. I don't know how, I don't know, but I'm really interested in how can we help, because we've got to find a different way forward. And here in Virginia, I don't know, maybe some of your curiosity can take you to missionary work. Go check out your big red counties to say, who are you? What's going on? How can we make this happen? So, and you've got experience and expertise that could answer that question.
We're going to take two more questions.
Yeah, I think.
We'll take somebody.
We'll talk.
Can you say your name?
My name is Beth Von Holly, and I'm more or less following up on what she just said, and it's addressed to you, Delegate. I loved your slides, and I was wondering, why did the poor people vote for Republican and not? What is their thinking? That's what I'm trying to understand.
We need a microphone.
Oh, well, I think the explanation's in more in the political campaigns than the reality of what we face. Let's face it, in the last election cycle, people were promised a return to coal. Coal's not coming back in Virginia. Not because President Obama did something to take it away. It's just not a viable option anymore. So we've got to figure out some way to get people to understand the realities in which they live, not the political hyperbole.